Hey class, how's it going? Um, I figured since we are going to be out of school for the next couple months till the end of the year, that I should try to make contact in a different way other than just over Google Classroom. So I did put a a poll on Google Classroom about who would be interested in Zoom classes, optional, starting next week. So make sure you respond to that. But I also thought with all this time that we have, we are supposed to be reading our novel, The Giver by Lois Lowry. That's what we are going to be reading before we unfortunately had to be quarantined or isolated at home. So all of the weekly activities, in case you haven't done them, are posted. So far we have 3 weeks up there. Week 4 is starting next week on Monday. So up until this point, you are supposed to be on through chapter 12. However, with all this time that's on our hands, I figured I would do a read through of the book. So I'm going to be doing these recordings. I'm going to start with chapter 1. So I will have each file labeled and I'll post them to Google Classroom. So if you want to read through with us, you can. If you want to read on your own, you can. I'm sure there's audios that you can find on YouTube, but as we're reading through the novel, I'm also going to kind of just do a little bit of discussion. It's not really going to be discussion because you are not responding in these recordings, but maybe once we start those Zoom classes, it can be more of a discussion and you guys can ask questions. You guys can be responding to some of the things from the novel. So our novel is The Giver. It's by Lois Lowry. It's a classic novel. It is read across the country by 8th graders. I read it when I was an 8th grader. So that is what we are reading, The Giver. And for those of you who have started it, you've probably been able to see that the world that our main character Jonas lives in is very, very different than the world that we live in. So things to keep in mind: this world that Jonas lives in is supposed to be set in the future, so keep that in mind. And otherwise, I think we're just going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'm going to be reading through, this is chapter 1. I will be pausing to do some discussion and maybe asking you some questions, giving you some more information related to the novel, okay? All right, so this is The Giver, chapter 1. It was almost December, and Jonas was beginning to be frightened. No, wrong word, Jonas thought. Frightened meant that deep, sickening feeling of something terrible about to happen. Frightened was the way he had felt a year ago when an unidentified aircraft had overflown the community twice. He had seen it both times. Squinting toward the sky, he had seen the sleek jet, almost a blur at its high speed, go past, and a second later heard the blast of sound that followed. Then, one more time a moment later, from the opposite direction, the same plane. At first, he had been only fascinated. He had never seen aircraft so close, for it was against the rules for pilots to fly over the community. Occasionally, when supplies were delivered by cargo planes to the landing field across the river, the children rode their bicycles to the riverbank and watched, intrigued, that means interested, the unloading and then the takeoff directed to the west, always from the community. But the aircraft a year ago had been different. It was not a squat, fat-bellied cargo plane, but a needle-nosed, single-pilot jet. Jonas, looking around anxiously, had seen others, adults as well as children, stop what they were doing and wait, confused, for an explanation of the frightening event. Then all of the citizens had been ordered to go into the nearest building and stay there. Immediately, the rasping voice through the speakers had said, "Leave your bicycles where they are." Instantly, obediently, Jonas had dropped his bike on its side on the path behind his family's dwelling. A dwelling is a home. He had run indoors and stayed there alone. His parents were both at work, and his little sister, Lily, was at the childcare center where she spent her after-school hours. Looking through the front window, he had seen no people, none of the busy afternoon crew of street cleaners, landscape workers, and food delivery people who usually populated the community at that time of day. He saw only the abandoned bikes here and there on their sides. An upturned wheel on one was still revolving slowly. He had been frightened then. The sense of his own community, silent, waiting, had made his stomach churn. He had trembled. But it had been nothing. Within minutes, the speakers had crackled again, and the voice, reassuring now and less urgent, had explained that a pilot in training had misread his navigational instructions and made a wrong turn. Desperately, the pilot had been trying to make his way back before his error had been noticed. "Needless to say, he will be released," the voice had said, followed by silence. There was an ironic tone to that final message, as if the speaker found it amusing, and Jonas had smiled a little, though he knew what a grim statement it had been. For a contributing citizen to be released from the community was a final decision, a terrible punishment, an overwhelming statement of failure. So a couple things so far. We know from the community that Jonas lives in, one thing that's really unusual is for planes to fly over, like jets. We hear jets all the time. You may not notice them, but if you sit there and it's quiet, you may hear a jet fly over. It's not a big deal. For them, it was a very scary situation. And also notice that the community, whoever's in charge, communicates with the citizens over a speaker. So in the same way that in our classroom we have the PA system that comes on for morning announcements, think of that, but in the streets, everywhere you go. You're riding around Madeira on your bike or walking around, which you shouldn't be now, but you do, and all of a sudden you're on a street corner by Starbucks and the system comes on and says, "Everybody drop what you're doing and get inside." So that's kind of the world that Jonas lives in his community. That's what they call their world. There's no name of the city. They just call it the community, in the same way that you guys live in Madeira. Also noticing that when they were talking about people getting inside, they told everyone to drop their bicycles. There are no cars. When Jonas looked outside, he didn't see a bunch of cars stopped. He saw bicycles. So be thinking about why there are no cars, and also why, for the most part, there are no planes. So there are two types of transportation that we use to travel long distances, and why that would not be allowed in the community. Next thing is talking about release. When they're released from the community, we'll learn more about that. But when you are released from something, you are let go. So this pilot in training made a mistake and he was let go from the community, never to return again. And we'll learn more about what that is, but it's a very shameful thing to be released from your community. It says it's a terrible punishment and a final decision, so you cannot come back. All right, so we are on page 3, towards the bottom, last paragraph. Even the children were scolded if they used the term lightly, released, at play, jeering or joking with a teammate who missed a catch or stumbled in a race. Jonas had done it once, had shouted at his best friend, "That's it, Asher, you're released," when Asher's clumsy error had lost a match for his team. He had been taken aside for a brief and serious talk by the coach, had hung his head with guilt and embarrassment, and apologized to Asher after the game. Now, thinking about the feeling of fear as he pedaled home along the river path, he remembered that moment of palpable, stomach-sinking terror when the aircraft had streaked above. It was not what he was feeling now, with December approaching. He searched for the right word to describe his own feeling. Jonas was careful about language, not like his friend Asher, who talked too fast and mixed things up, scrambling words and phrases until they were barely recognizable and often very funny. Jonas grinned, remembering the morning that Asher had dashed into the classroom, late as usual, arriving breathlessly in the middle of the chanting of the morning anthem. When the class took their seats at the conclusion of the patriotic hymn, Asher remained standing to make his public apology, as was required. "I apologize for inconveniencing my learning community," Asher ran through the standard apology phrase rapidly, still catching his breath. The instructor in class waited patiently for his explanation. The students had all been grinning because they had listened to Asher's explanations so many times before. I left home at the correct time, but when I was riding along the hatchery, the crew was separating some salmon. I guess I just got distraught watching them. I apologize to my classmates, Asher concluded. He smoothed his rumpled tunic and sat down. A tunic is a type of robe that they wear. We accept your apology, Asher. The class recited the standard response in unison. Many of the students were biting their lips to keep from laughing. I accept your apology, Asher, the instructor said. He was smiling. And I thank you because once again, you have provided an opportunity for a lesson in language. Distraught is too strong an adjective to describe salmon viewing. He turned and wrote distraught on the instructional board. Beside it, he wrote distracted. Jonas, nearing his home now, smiled at the recollection. Thinking still as he wheeled his bike into its narrow port beside the door, he realized that frightened was the wrong word to describe his feelings. Now that December was almost here, it was too strong an adjective. He had waited a long time for this special December. Now that it was almost upon him, he wasn't frightened, but he was eager, he decided. He was eager for it to come, and he was excited, certainly. All of the 11s were excited about the event that would be coming soon, but there was a little shudder of nervousness when he thought about it, about what might happen. Apprehensive, Jonas decided. That's what I am. So Jonas, you can see in the community, language is very important to them, using the correct language to show what you mean. Throughout this whole first part of the chapter, Jonas has been trying to figure out the best word to describe his feeling, and he comes up with apprehensive, eager, excited, and maybe even a little bit frightened. So we don't know what's happening yet in December. We know that it's a big deal, especially this December, whatever's coming up. And he says that all of the 11s, if you look at the bottom of page 5, all of the 11s were excited about the event that would be coming so soon. So 11s, that's referring to an age group. So anyone who is age 11 are referred to as 11s, 12s, 2s, 3s, 9s, and they will be referred to that way throughout the novel. So right now we can conclude that Jonas is 11 years old, and something is going to be happening in December that is leading him to feel a little bit anxious, apprehensive, excited. Okay, top of page 6, right after that break. Who wants to be the first tonight for feelings? Jonas's father asked at the conclusion of their evening meal. It was one of their rituals. It's kind of like a tradition or maybe something you do every night. That's a ritual. It was one of the rituals, the evening telling of feelings. Sometimes Jonas and his sister Lily argued over turns, over who would get to go first. Their parents, of course, were part of the ritual. They, too, told their feelings each evening. But like all parents, all adults, they didn't fight and wheedle for their turn, nor did Jonas tonight. His feelings were too complicated this evening. He wanted to share them, but he wasn't eager to begin the process of sifting through his own complicated emotions, even with the help that he knew his parents could give. You go, Lily, he said, seeing his sister, who was much younger, only 7 years old, wiggling with impatience in her chair. I felt very angry this afternoon, Lily announced. My childcare group was in the play area, and we had a visiting group of 7s, and they didn't obey the rules at all. One of them, a male, it's a boy, I don't know his name, kept going right to the front of the line for the slide, even though the rest of us were all waiting. I felt so angry at him. I made my hand into a fist like this. She held up a clenched fist, and the rest of the family smiled at her small, defiant gesture. Why do you think the visitors didn't obey the rules? Mother asked. Lily considered and shook her head. I don't know. They acted like animals, Jonas suggested. He laughed. That's right, Lily said, laughing too. Like animals. Neither child knew what the word meant exactly, but it was often used to describe someone uneducated or clumsy, Someone who didn't fit in. Where were the visitors from? Father asked. Lily frowned, trying to remember. Our leader told us when he made the welcome speech, but I can't remember. I guess I wasn't paying attention. It was from another community. They had to leave very early and they had their midday meal on the bus. Mother nodded. Do you think it's possible that their rules may be different, and so they simply didn't know what your play area rules were? Lily shrugged and nodded. I suppose. You visited other communities, haven't you? Jonas asked. My group has, often. Lily nodded again. When we were sixes, we went and shared a whole school day with a group of sixes in their community. How did you feel when you were there? Lily frowned. I felt strange because their methods were different. They were learning usages that my group hadn't learned yet, so we felt stupid. Father was listening with interest. I'm thinking, Lily, he said, about the boy who didn't obey the rules today. Do you think it's possible that he felt strange and stupid being in a new place with rules that he didn't know about? Lily pondered that. Yes, she said finally. I feel a little sorry for him, Jonas said, even though I don't even know him. I feel sorry for anyone who is in a place where he feels strange and stupid. How do you feel now, Lily? Father asked. Still angry? I guess not, Lily decided. I guess I feel a little sorry for him. And sorry I made a fist. She grinned. Jonas smiled back at his sister. Lily's feelings were always straightforward, fairly simple, usually easy to resolve. He guessed that his own had been too when he was a 7. He listened politely, though not very attentively, while his father took his turn, describing a feeling of worry that he'd had that day at work, a concern about one of the new children. A new child is a baby, okay? New children are babies. About one of the new children who wasn't doing well at all. Jonas's father's title was nurturer. He and the other nurturers were responsible for all the physical and emotional needs of every new child during its earliest life. It was a very important job, Jonas knew, but it wasn't one that interested him much. So Jonas's father, he's think of it as like a nurse or a doctor, mostly for newborn children or babies. So he's a nurturer. What gender is it? Lily asked. Male, Father said. He's a sweet little male with a lovely disposition, but he isn't growing as fast as he should, and he doesn't sleep soundly. He doesn't sleep well. We have him in the extra care section for supplementary nurturing, but the committee is beginning to talk about releasing him. Oh no, Mother murmured sympathetically. I know how sad that must make you feel. Remember, releasing is when they're let go from the community? Jonas and Lily both nodded sympathetically as well. Release of new children was always sad because they hadn't had a chance to enjoy life within their community yet, and they hadn't done anything wrong. There were only 2 occasions of release which were not punishment. This is one of your questions on the assignment, okay? Release of the elderly, which was a time of celebration for a life well and fully lived. And release of a new child, which always brought a sense of, what could we have done? This was especially troubling for the nurturers, like Father, who felt they had failed somehow, but it happened very rarely. So we have 3 occasions of release. 1 for punishment, like the pilot in training who was kicked out or released from the community. We have elderly people who are released or let go from the community when they're no longer needed there. And then we also have release of a new child when they're just not doing as well. They're not going to be a good fit for the community, so they are also released or let go. Those are your 3 occasions of release. Second paragraph on page 10. Well, Father said, I'm going to keep trying. I may ask the committee for permission to bring him here at night, if you don't mind. You know what the night crew nurturers are like. I think this little guy needs something extra. Of course, Mother said, and Jonas and Lily nodded. They had heard Father complain about the night crew before. It was a lesser job, so not as well, kind of looked down upon. It was a lesser job, night crew nurturing, assigned to those who lacked the interest or skills or insight for the more vital or important jobs of the daytime hours. Most of the people on the night crew had not even been given spouses. That's a husband or a wife. They had not even been given, keep that in mind, spouses, because they lacked somehow the essential capacity to connect to others, which was required for the creation of a family unit. A family unit is a family. Maybe we could even keep him, Lily suggested sweetly, trying to look innocent. The look was fake, Jonas knew. They all knew. Lily, Mother reminded her, smiling, you know the rules. 2 children, 1 male, 1 female to each family unit. It was written very clearly in the rules. Lily giggled. Well, she said, I thought maybe just this once. Next, Mother, who held a prominent, that's a very important position at the Department of Justice, talked about her feelings. Today, a repeat offender had been brought before her, someone who had broken the rules before, someone who she hoped had been adequately and fairly punished, and who had been restored to his place, to his job, his home, his family unit. To see him brought before her a second time caused her overwhelming feelings of frustration and anger, and even guilt that she hadn't made a difference in his life. I feel frightened too for him, she confessed. You know that there's no third chance. The rules say that if there's a third transgression, he simply has to be released. Jonas shivered. He knew it happened. There was even a boy in his group of 11s whose father had been released years before. No one ever mentioned it. The disgrace was unspeakable. It was hard to imagine. Lily stood up and went to her mother. She stroked her mother's arm. From his place at the table, Father reached over and took her hand. Jonas reached for the other. One by one, they comforted her. Soon she smiled, thanked them, and murmured that she felt soothed. The ritual continued. Jonas, Father asked, your last tonight? Jonas sighed. This evening, he almost would have preferred to keep his feelings hidden, but it was, of course, against the rules. I'm feeling apprehensive, he confessed, glad that the appropriate descriptive word had finally come to him. Why is that, son? His father looked concerned. I know there's really nothing to worry about, Jonas explained, and that every adult has been through it. I know you have, Father, and you too, Mother, but it's the ceremony that I'm apprehensive about. It's almost December. Lily looked up, her eyes wide. The ceremony of 12, she whispered in an awed voice. Even the smallest children, Lily's age and younger, knew that it lay in the future for each of them. I'm glad you told us of your feelings, Father said. Lily, Mother said, beckoning to the little girl, go on now and get into your night clothes. Father and I are going to stay here and talk to Jonas for a while. Lily sighed, but obediently she got down from her chair. Privately, she asked. Mother nodded. Yes, she said. This talk will be a private one with Jonas. Okay, so that's chapter 1. A couple things that I want to talk about here at the end. We know now that the thing that Jonas is very apprehensive or anxious about is a ceremony called the Ceremony of 12. It's when all of the 11s turn 12 years old. And we're going to learn more about that in the next chapter. Another thing I want you to keep in mind, you guys know that I posted on Google Classroom about how you were feeling, and I wanted to, know how you were feeling, but really it's kind of optional. I had a few students that responded to me privately. So in the community, it is a ritual that is required. It's part of the rules that every single night at dinner time, every single person in the family was required to share their feelings. Think about how odd that might be. I know there's a lot of times where I don't want everyone to know my feelings. That's kind of like a private thing, or I want the freedom to be able to or not tell my feelings. So Jonas is required. Everyone in the family is required. So think about how if every night you had to sit down at the dinner table and you all had to share your feelings, that would be very, very odd, but it's required in the community. Another thing to keep in mind is that we talked about release. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about. Oh, the family unit. So every family in our world is made up of however many people are in the family. We have people who are single parents. We have people who have gotten married and maybe gotten divorced. We have families that have 7, 8, 9 children. We had families that have no children, one child. We can see that a family unit, that's just another word for a family in the community. There are two parents, there's a mother and a father, and then you have two children. You are allowed to have two children. They must be a male and a female. So be thinking about how they're able to control that, because obviously with our technology now, we cannot control whether a baby is going to be born a male or a female. It's whatever happens, nature takes its course. So somehow they're able to control that. Be thinking about that. And also a spouse, that's a husband or a wife. The way that people get spouses in a community is they have to apply for a spouse, like submit an application. And if you have not shown that you are able to emotionally connect, then you don't get a spouse. Your spouse is also assigned to you. You will learn more about that in the following chapters, but you don't get to pick your own spouse. You don't get to pick how many children you have beyond the two. There's a lot of things that you cannot pick. So keep that in mind as we're reading these chapters, just how much the community is able to control the lives of the people who live there. Okay, so make sure that you answer those questions for the week 1 activities if you haven't yet. I have graded those that have submitted them. If you have any questions, I'm going to be posting this to Google Classroom. You can put it in the comments below, or you can email me, either way, but make sure if you have questions that you ask them. Okay, all right guys, I miss you all. This is very weird, let's just be honest, but we make do with what we have, and I hope you are all doing okay for the situation. This is a really hard time, not only because a lot of you are bored, but I know with some families, I know of some students whose parents work in healthcare, they're working at hospitals. I know some people who have lost their jobs. So this is really a tough time for our world right now, and some people are having a tougher time than others. So keep that in mind. Be kind to those around you. Make contact with your friends. People are feeling a little bit lonely, I think. So as always, let me know if you need anything, and hopefully we'll be able to talk and have a Zoom class next week. Okay? All right, guys. Miss you, and we'll talk soon. Okay? Bye.